Everybody, today we're going to look at Confucianism, and we're actually going to separate it from a very similar and perhaps complementary religion, Taoism, which we're going to talk about next time. Now, before we get into Confucianism, though, it is important to understand the relationship between these two Chinese religions. And while they are technically separate religions, it's often the case that people will practice both because of their complementary nature. And part of that complementary nature is based on a fundamental outlook of these two philosophy, these two religions, and is based off of this understanding of yin and yang. And I'm sure we've heard these terms, and it really deals with basically the active and receptive principles of the world. So yang in general terms refers to any kind of active or positive principle, while yin is a general term for a receptive or a negative principle. And it's going to be these two principles that will balance each other out in nature. And so there's going to be this interplay in what produces everything we know, essentially this interplay in nature. So what nature is this balancing act between the positive and the negative, and neither can exist without the other. So this is going to be the foundation of both Confucianism and Taoism, and is going to even exhibit these two religions as yang and yin. So looking a little bit more carefully at these concepts, yang and yin, again, it's this kind of harmonious interplay, which is the goal of a person's life. So as opposed to some of the other religions that we've looked at in this class, the purpose of life is simply to just be a part of nature, to be one with nature. And nature is this balance, this process, this positive, the negative, the active and receptive. And so our life is going to require that same sort of balance, that same sort of interplay and harmoniousness within ourselves, within our relationships, within how we govern. And we'll see that Confucianism will represent one side, while Taoism will represent the other. So both Taoism and Confucianism will complement each other like yang and yin complement each other in terms of the active and receptive. So looking a little bit more carefully at Confucius, the person, Confucius, often Latinized from Kung Fu Tzu, meaning Kung the teacher, was born in 551. Notice that this is around the same time that both Buddha and Muhammad were around. And Confucius lived in poverty, lived in a family where his father died at a young age when he was 3, and he became basically a tutor in his 20s, and began teaching and having this reputation as a kind of honest and wise man. And so as he was teaching, he would start to edit texts, start to become lightly involved with politics, but unfortunately couldn't move too far because of his honesty, but never stopped trying to kind of enhance society, to enhance government, and really try and teach how to be a part of this kind of natural order. And so out of his teachings grew this idea of Confucianism. And it boils down to a kind of a restored order between yang and yin. So our behavior, our lives, required the same balance that exhibited in nature. But before we could govern, before we could dictate behavior, we first had to work on ourselves, and then our family, and then families, until we could expand these teachings, this balance, to the rest of society. And so Confucianism is really the teachings of this kind of restored order of yin and yin, and understanding how we can live in harmony with all of these competing forces. And so his teachings are quite logical, they're quite rational. And this is going to be one of the kind of complaints that will spawn the emergence of Taoism, is that Confucius gives pretty rational, systematic teachings, as opposed to, let's say, Buddha, who taught about his path and his way. Confucius tells of teachings that should be followed systematically so that our lives and our governments and our societies can balance in this harmonious way and really create this the purpose of life, which again is just being one with nature, right? Rather than trying to go against the grain or fight against natural causes. And so his teachings can be summed up really in 5 principles: Zhen, Chunzu, Li, Te, and Win. And so we'll look at each of these in more detail. So beginning with Zhen, or the humaneness, this is the virtue of all virtues. This is going to essentially guide the rest of Confucius's 5 principles, and essentially it's respect for one's own dignity as a human being, right? Understanding that you are a person within a society of other people and showing respect for those other people as you show respect for yourself. So essentially loving another as you love yourself. This is going to be that basis, right? We should strive to appreciate and love others and show respect for others like we do for ourselves, because this is going to lead to better relationships. This is going to lead to better behavior and how we conduct ourselves in this society, because whether we like it or not, we are born into a society. We are required, we are dependent on others, and so it's important to share this kind of humaneness, this humanness, and a love for one another like we would love ourselves. Next is essentially being the ideal person. And so this is taking that kind of abstract quality of Zhen and putting it into action. So rather than just loving someone like you love yourself, actually acting upon that love in the same similar fashion. So it's not necessarily enough to just love someone or respect someone like you love or respect yourself, but actually doing the things for others that you would do for yourself. So essentially, putting your behavior, putting that Zhen into a kind of habitual action. So taking part, having the right attitude when dealing with someone, being kind to, charitable, showing concern, and really expressing that love in action. And so this means more than just kind of the right etiquette and politeness, but really feeling and experiencing that humaneness for the world as well as you do yourself. So really, we're not just loving the world, but we're showing that through these actions. Next is Li, or the right pattern, meaning the right way in which we do things, but also doing things in the right way. So there's really 2 parts to this, right? Doing things the right way and having the correct sort of ritual for doing them. So we might think of an example of the first, doing things in the right way, when taking an employment test in a room with hundreds of other applicants, one does not show the instructor one's baby pictures, right? It's a time to be professional. It's a time to do what you need to do. And what you need to do is take this employment test in this professional manner. And it's not just being able to do this in the right way, but again, having the right ritual for doing it. So when doing this, we have particular rituals that society has set forth that we want to follow and adhere to. For instance, completing the required formalities such as putting last name first, first name last, right? Dating papers and things like that. So we want to make sure that we're doing things in the right way, but that we're also using the kind of agreed upon correct ritual when doing them. Again, it's about not going against the grain. It's about not pushing back against society or the rituals that society creates. Instead, it's all about the kind of flow and adhering to these kind of competing, active, and receptive forces within nature, and letting oneself kind of create a situation in which we can kind of stay in this balancing act, right? We're trying to put ourselves in a place where we can be both yang and yin. We can be in a place where we're not fighting nature, but instead living within it. And so when reconstructing society, Confucius stated these 5 general categories of doing things in the right sort of way. So there's 5 additional categories for Li. Those are essentially using the right name for the right thing. So again, kind of taking responsibility, doing things in the right way, using the formalities when formalities are required, choosing the mean between 2 extremes. This is something, if you'll recall from Buddhism, is a important idea, that kind of middle path. Again, if we're looking at 2 extremes of yang and yin balancing each other out, we want to try and find that middle path for how to do things. We don't necessarily want to just happily accept our place. We also don't want to fight against our place. We want to try and find that happy medium that is going to be between the 2 extremes that will allow for that harmonious balance, right? Because it's all about living in the balance. And living the 5 basic relationships. So within these 5 categories, another set of relationships, conducting yourself in the appropriate father-son relationship, conducting yourself properly in the older brother, younger brother relationship. There is the husband and wife relationship, the older friend, younger friend relationship, and ruler-subject relationship. So again, it's finding that balance between these 2 relationships, not getting too heavy-handed on one side, not getting too heavy-handed on the other, instead kind of creating this cohesive, cooperative relationship that will allow us to act in the right way with those proper formalities. The 4th of the 5 general categories, kind of devotion to the family, and lastly, respect for age. So we can see these 5 categories as really not justifying, but really expressing what our important roles are, what we should be doing in terms of keeping that behavior. And it really goes into showing kind of how Chinese culture has developed over the last 1,000 years, really seeing this kind of, again, devotion to the family, more of this cooperative nature that we don't necessarily see in Western cultures like the United States. In the United States, we're very individualistic. We're very much an individualist nation. But in China and relatively Japan, we see this kind of more heavily concentrated emphasis on the family, on respect for the elder, right? Respect for one's age, and really the kind of balance within these different relationships. So we're seeing these kinds of guidelines for behavior, and not just how they affect the individual, but how they affect the family and how then it can affect society's behavior in general. Next is Te, and is government by moral power. So again, if Confucius is trying to enlighten us how to act in terms of how to create this harmonious balance in nature, uh, it's important to move from the family, from the individual behavior to society and government. And so it's important when it comes to government role that government should be based on the power of good example rather than tyrannical power and submission. So we want a government that is sincere. We want a government that strives for the people that it governs and is not subjugating them or holding them down on purpose for some individuals to gain more power. When governments do this type of tyrannical move, we see that this kind of hidden resentment begins to build, which will then eventually explode out in revolution. And so when we're acting in a government setting, we want to act as exemplars. We want to act by showing good example and expressing that sincerity in that we are governing the people. We are there for the people. Confucius believed that this was the form of lasting government, right? It's lasting governments are those that kind of win the consent of the people, not governments that hold people down and rule in fear. These type of governments will eventually become corrupted and revolted against. And so it's really important that our behavior moves beyond the family to the government. And again, it kind of keeps this harmonious balance in the world. Lastly, is when or the cultivation of the peaceful arts. Confucius believed that it was the arts that were key to our kind of finding a balance in our life. Things like art or music, philosophy, literature, poetry, right? These things are good and beautiful. And the more that we focus our attention on the arts, the less we would be inclined to go to war or become corrupted. I mean, think about how these types of artistic expressions are looked at in the world, right? We typically use music or art to bring people together, not to separate them. And so it's art and music that we should focus our energies on and really kind of cultivate so that people will begin to see the good and the beautiful, not just in those particular pieces of art, but also in the world and in life in general. If the more we're seeing that love, then it kind of cycles back to this idea of Jen, this idea of loving something as you love yourself, appreciating things like you appreciate yourself, and it will lead to this proper behavior and this kind of coexistence with not just other people in the world, but with the world in general. So unlike some of the other religions that we looked at earlier in the semester, Confucianism is very much this kind of atheistic religion, this religion that doesn't need a god. It's more inclined to say that nature is this thing that we are born into, that we are a part of, and we should not be fighting against it. Our purpose in life, our aim is to exist within this natural balance of the universe. And the better we can do that, the better it is for us and everybody else. So we want to try and find that harmonious balance of our existence with the existence of the rest of the universe. And this is what Confucius is again, systematically trying to teach through these rational steps. He's particularly saying that if you were to follow these particular steps, right, that will lead us to the balance. Again, kind of differentiating that from the Buddha and this one individual path that could be something very different from somebody else's individual path. Confucius is saying, like, no, I'm laying down these strict guidelines. And so when we think about Confucianism, we think about this kind of very rational way in which we can look at behavior and how we can systematically cultivate people. So again, as the teacher, he's trying to teach people this is the way, this is the path, right, as opposed to a path that will get us to that yang-yin balance, that harmonious kind of position where we're not fighting against the grain, not necessarily going completely in a way where we're just letting the world happen. We're systematically putting ourselves in that right position to behave. And so there should be no piety. There should be no need for God, at least in the way that we see Judaism or Christianity or Islam. There's just no need for that. God, if we were to call a God, God just is this nature, right? And there's no omniscient, omnipotent force. It's more of just the way the world is, reliant on this kind of balancing act, this kind of yin and yang, hot and cold, light and dark, right? Really appreciating the delicate nature and delicate balance of the universe. And so Confucius takes this into account and suggests that the rational mind, right, our ability to rationalize and systematically follow these particular principles, these particular categories, adhere to these types of relationships, are really what are going to create a harmony and balance. Now again, distinguishing this from Taoism, which we'll look at next time, Taoism is very similar to Confucianism, really honing in on that kind of fundamental nature of yang and yin, harmonious balance in nature. But rather than taking this active and systematic approach to finding your way in nature, instead Taoism is going to step back and take a more receptive stance and say, just let the balance take over, let nature take over, and really kind of give up that control that you may think you have, that you really don't. We'll look at that one next time.